I was interested in their reaction of what it would be, and they really liked it. And so, we need some joy, don't we?
Yes. Amen.
I need some joy. The circumstances of our nation and culture is so dismal. If I may speak as an almost centurion, I've never seen it so dismal and dark and horrific. There's been some bad times in America, to say the truth, but we need some joy. And we need some lightness, and that's what the Suttons do all over, wherever they go.
Amen.
They are spreading joy, and people so desperately need it. Before I retired, I got this little thing in my bones that I was going to learn to play the guitar. And so went over to Guitar Center, and I bought a guitar, and I picked around on it a couple times, and I had the same problem as I did when I was a kid. I couldn't get the C note. I couldn't get those two strings pushed down, and I just put it away and put it in the closet, and been thinking about selling it down at the pawn shop. And then when we heard the Suttons were coming, I had that idea. I was just going to give them that guitar because I knew they'd be going out to New Mexico to the Indian reservations. And so sure enough, they found a young man that was wanting to learn to play the guitar, and he couldn't afford to buy one. So, and so they were able to give him that guitar, and I'm just thrilled to death about it.
Amen.
And so praise God for their music, and we need it. But we also need knowledge, and we need biblical knowledge. And knowledge that supplements the Bible, that supports the Bible, is also useful, as Brother Watson said this morning about apologetics. So very often in my door-to-door and answer some of the ideas that people have. So it's very useful as a witness to have a knowledge bank about things that people have opinions in. Now, going back 150 years to a guy named Darwin, he wrote, of course, that famous book, The Origin of Species. That was 1859, just before the Civil War. And his book and his ideas took off. They were not new. As I said yesterday, actually, evolution goes clear back to the Greeks. And I think that it goes back, as a matter of fact, to that scene in the Garden of Eden when Satan tempted Eve, convinced her that she could be a goddess. And I think that and this is just my opinion, but my opinion is that the idea that he lodged in her mind is that God was not the eternal being, but he was an evolved being. And therefore, the idea was that in her mind was that she too could evolve to become a goddess and even evolve to the status of the Creator God. This is awful close to Mormon theology, if you kind of notice that. Maybe just a few years after his book, maybe about 18, evolution would be vindicated, that it would be absolutely proven by the fossils. And so for now 150 years, scientists have been collecting fossils. So now, according to Dr. Jerry Bergman with the Institute of Creation Research, more than 1 billion fossils have been found, unearthed, and cataloged, photographed, put into books, studied. Expert anatomists, zoologists, experts in every area, botanists, you name it, have carefully studied these fossils. The issue primarily with these fossils as it relates to evolution is what is called transitions. All of my life, I've heard of the missing link. When I was as small as some of these children, I heard people talking about the missing link. And it was very much something that was hoped for, that the missing link would be discovered between monkeys and man. The missing link was the creature that was between monkeys and man, and that established that monkeys evolved into man. And of course, there has been some claims that has been done. Some scientists, the Leakeys in Africa and some others, have from time to time claimed that they have found these one or more missing links. Biology textbooks have carried pictures. I'll show you a picture tonight. For more than 100 years, that declared to beginning science teachers that this has all been found and wrapped up and certified. And so let's take a little trip and look at the fossil record. And so if you will give me slide 1. First off, what are fossils? Well, fossils are impressions, or they are specimens of living creatures. Wood. Yeah, that's what that petrified wood is. It's wood that lived long ago, and it became mineralized by chemical processes. Atoms in our molecules are slowly replaced with other elements such as silicon. And by this process, an animal or a part of an animal that's flesh and bone slowly has become mineral or even rock, virtually. So they are impressions or mineralized specimens of ancient living plants or animals. The neat thing about fossils, and I believe that this is by the providence of God, God saw to it that these fossils would be preserved, and that written records that attested to such things as the flood. Fossils preserve the anatomical features, and we'll show you some pictures here in a minute that shows this. And by these preserved samples, these specialists can examine them, and they can examine the fossils, and what they're particularly looking for are those so-called transitional fossils, which would be fossils that are, according to the expert's eye, in the process of transition. It's not this or it's not that. It's in a transition. It's like feathers. Feathers being a very complex organ, but if feathers came about through evolution, then there should be fossils showing feathers in these various stages of development. Okay, so that's what's just amazing and exciting about fossils. Scientists who study fossils are called paleontologists. But many different scientific disciplines get involved: anatomists, zoologists, botanists, and such like. And the thing with fossils is that they preserve the tiny anatomical details. And the experts can examine these anatomical details, and these can be discerned so that comparisons can be made between the fossils that are dug up, and the evolutionists say, well, this fossil is 200 million years old. And then it can be compared to the same animal today, and what is found is the old and the new is the same. Don't go sleep on me back there now. You're doing a good job. All right, well, how are fossils formed? Well, evolutionists have a little bit different explanation than creation scientists. because the evolutionists, of course, say that Earth and life traces back 4.6 billion years. Of course, the formation of the universe occurred about 14 billion years ago. But we'll just take the 4.6 billion years. So the evolutionists say that these are animals that died, and they were slowly buried just over time. But there's a huge problem. Or Institute of Creation Research say uniformly that the fossils were formed from the worldwide flood. As the water gushed out of the crust of the earth and poured out of the sky, it liquefied the continents. It uprooted the plant life, of course, killing animals. And it washed all of this stuff into the seas that existed at that time. This formed virtual tsunamis of mud and debris. And these tsunamis, if you've ever seen pictures of tsunamis, like the one in Malaysia here a few years ago, where that water surges in and it comes in, at 50 miles an hour, and people cannot flee from it. And so these tsunamis of mud and debris caught these animals in the seas and buried them instantly. And I'll show you a picture of a dinosaur that I think you can see that. I don't have a picture of this one, but the most amazing picture that I've seen shows a shark, the fossil of a large shark, and inside that fossil there is a army of debris and instantly killed and buried. That quick burial is what preserves the fossils because they can't decay. And so they're buried, and then the tremendous pressure from above and the heat that develops is what instigates that process of mineralization. So pressure and heat converts living tissues such as flesh, bone, feathers, scales, teeth. Now, some parts of bodies don't fossilize as well as others. Creatures that really fossilize well would be your shellfish, like clams and such like. Fish, pretty well, at least they're skeletal, but still some remains of flesh that's been mineralized, and so forth, are all preserved. Okay, next slide. So as I've already explained, the flood dumped massive quantities of mud, rock, and land plants into the ocean. It formed these underwater debris, and there occurred instant burial. And of course, this led to... They will never suggest that there was a worldwide the flood described in Genesis 6, 7, and 8. And so these anatomical details were preserved, and I believe by the providence of God, because now these are working in the... And so as I say there at the top, fossils are unwritten records from the past. To the eye of an expert anatomist, zoologist, paleontologist, whatever, to that practiced and skillful eye, fossils might as well be something written could read in a language that we could read. And praise God for these individuals. So, here's an example of people say, well, we don't need science. But without these scientists and these specialists and their skills and their knowledge, we wouldn't have this knowledge. So some of you might want to go on and serve God and become creation scientists. There's a difference. But you're going into a very difficult path if you do, I can tell you that. So they allow scientists to compare ancient creatures to living animals. Now, a lot of fossils to discover that a creature that they have long, whose name escapes me, and by the way, that point this morning I forgot, the train never did come in on that one. Anyway, coelacanth, the train just came in. Woo-hoo! Coelacanth. Yeah, here's a fish, an ancient fish. They said, yeah, that fish is extinct 200 million years ago. In the 1930s, hello, they found them swimming in the seas. And that's amazing too. The comparisons allow scientists to draw scientifically based conclusions. Talked a little bit about science yesterday. Science is based upon experiments, storytelling. It's not based on imagination. It's based upon the past, even 6,000 years into the past. We can't draw conclusions from it. And so it was through fossils that dinosaurs were discovered some 300 years ago. And of course, dinosaurs really tore up the theology, really tore up churches once they were found. Next slide. So evolution is said to have occurred in very tiny steps that added up to great changes in body structure. And so one kind of creature became completely a different kind of creature. I'll show you some examples of that. Now, so as I've already said, if evolution did occur, there should be these transition fossils of creatures that were in between. They died, and they should have been preserved, and we should have fossils of them. It's not like there's not enough fossils that have been found. Over 1 billion have now been found. So I've already talked about Darwin. Poor Darwin died frustrated. But he had great hopes. He said, I have great hopes that one day enough fossils will be found that will support my theory. And so billions of fossils have been found, but the so-called missing links, or what today is called transitional forms, have not been found. In fact, according to Dr. Jerry Bergman, an expert in this area, he says not a single true transitional fossil has ever been formed. Next slide. Found. In fact, here are some statements from scientists, several scientists. One says there exists no half-fish, half-bird fossils. Another says not a single fossil has been unearthed that has even been claimed to be strong evidence of giraffe evolution. Giraffes, what's the deal with giraffes? Well, the storyline on that is, how did giraffes get long necks? And so a century and a half ago, one of the prevailing ideas among evolutionists was that giraffes were like horses, and there wasn't much grass, and so they began stretching their necks up to eat leaves off of trees, and they stretched their necks up so much that gradually the necks grew. Now, this theory has been totally eliminated. Even evolutionists now heuristics. It's just silly. And so, but even if there's some other mechanism for giraffes having long necks, then there should be transitional fossils from that horse structure to, here's a giraffe, it's in between. In all of these millions of fossils in the green, no clear transitional forms have ever been located. And Bergman goes on to say, creation predicts that we would not find transitional forms between the phyla, the classes, and so forth. You see, in science, the power to predict is extremely important. If you have the power to predict what you might discover down the road, and then it happens, it shows that your hypothesis is on the right track. If your predictions don't come to pass, it shows you're on the wrong track. It's the same thing as your biblical prophets. Hey. All right, next slide. Some examples of fossils. Next slide. All right, here's a obviously a dinosaur footprint. I want to encourage you folks who take vacations over in the Fort Worth area, go to Glen Rose, Texas. It's about 30 miles south of Fort Worth. It's right on that interstate. Is it 30 or 35? I can't remember. Anyway, there's a place there. It's called Dinosaur Valley, I think, National Park. It's a place rich in dinosaur fossils. The standard secularists have a museum there that you can visit. But there's also a museum. It's called the Choo Choo. Anyway, it's a creationist museum. It was started by Dr. Jerry Baugh, and the Creation Evidences Museum. Train came in. Creation Evidences Museum. We visited there. Well, my son is 41, horribly underfunded, but I understand it's still there. But anyway, there's a river that comes down along there. It's the Paluxy River, and you can walk along the Paluxy River, and these footprints like that are everywhere along there. And those footprints were formed by dinosaurs fleeing the flood. They were fleeing to high ground. And of course, they left those tracks in the mud, and then the mud was quickly buried, and those impressions were turned to stone, and they're preserved today. It's very, very interesting. And by the way, if you get in that area, you can go over to Dallas. Institute of Creation Research has a new museum that's just been operating for about the last 3 or 4 years. I was involved in a small way here in Amarillo in getting that going. And it's a phenomenal thing, and I encourage you to go there. Sometime I would love to go there myself. All right, next slide. All right, here we have a dragonfly. This is an example of what fossils do for us. So your experts on insects can examine that fossil, and then they can compare the anatomy of that fossil to a modern-day dragonfly, and guess what? It's the same. No difference whatsoever. So dragonfly is supposed to go back 300, 400, 500 million years. During all that time, they haven't changed a bit. That doesn't speak evolution. Next slide. Here's a beautiful fossil. This is an impression where a fern leaf laid in the mud and then was quickly buried. And if you could look closely at it, the detail that's preserved is just stunning. So a botanist can look at that. They would be able to identify that particular leaf right down to the species that it would be assigned to today. And so again, you can compare what was found as a fossil and look at that species today, no difference. And no in-between transitional forms. Next slide. This amazing slide is of some ancient type of creatures called trilobites. They lived on the bottom of the sea. That is, they were actually wiped out in the flood because they lived on the seafloor. And so they would have been the very first creatures buried by those deluges of mud and so forth. Trilobites still alive because, hello, we haven't investigated the oceans very much, especially the floor of the oceans. But the detail that you can see in these, the spinal column and the segments and the eyes and the head, the detail is just stunning. And so that shows you the power of these fossils. Next slide. Now here is an interesting. You don't find fossils can't even find all of the pieces, because you can imagine the flood would kill an animal and it would just destroy many of the bodies that were existing. But this is a rare find here, and by the way, if you can see closely, I didn't bring my pointer in, but right up there's a wheelbarrow. And right down there's a man, and there's another person, and over there is a person. So you can see the size of this thing. But it's a whole fossil of a dinosaur. Now look at its neck. Look at the position of that neck. This creature appears to have died a very violent death. It was buried, and it's remember, this is a large dinosaur, a powerful creature, and yet it looks like a huge hand came down and grabbed a hold of that head and yanked it around like it was a piece of rubber. That's exactly what you would expect from a worldwide flood. But that's an amazing fossil find there. Now this is an artist's conception of a fish impression, but it's realistic as to what is found. Next one. Here is an actual fish fossil, and you can see the details. The head is kind of messed up, but there's quite a bit that can be seen. You can clearly see the spine. You can see the radial bones coming out from the spine. You can see the anal fin here. You can see the rays here and the tail fin, the pectoral fin here. You can see the teeth. This looks very much like some, as I say, when the flood happened and these deluges of mud came, the creatures that were on the bottom, they were the first to go, the first buried. And so that means, by the way, that when, I'll show you some pictures of layers, but in the so-called geologic column, that explains why they're at the bottom. The evolutionists say they're at the bottom because they're the oldest. They were the beginning of life. But it was in 1950, geological engineer laid out the mechanics of the flood. And it was a book that turned science world, even the evolutionists, upside down. All right, next slide. So now, if that's not enough, a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, a lady scientist, there's room in science for ladies, girls. A lady scientist was studying the femur bone, that's this upper bone of a Tyrannosaurus rex. So it would have been a very large bone, maybe as long as this altar. She's studying this femur bone, and of course you want to remember that dinosaurs are supposed to have lived 300 million years ago. And so as she was examining this, and they drilled collagen material. What is collagen? Collagen is a protein that God uses in your joints to cushion your joint movement. Now, you would expect after 300 million years that everything of that dinosaur would have turned to rock. Here she found this flexible tissue, this collagen tissue. Well, she was a decent scientist, and so she reported it to her colleagues at some risk to her own reputation. But she reported it in terms that were acceptable, and she avoided the obvious conclusion to that. And so her colleagues were astonished, of course, and of course they all rushed to her lab, and they checked it for themselves, and they couldn't deny her find. But they had various explanations for why there would be flexible tissue in there. One guy said it's not actually tissue. What it is that somebody left their sandwich in the lab, and the sandwich somehow got into the sample. But bottom line is flexible tissue should not be found inside of fossils that are millions of years old. Now, this is not the only find like that. Now, numerous other finds have been found with flexible tissue inside of them. Even viable red blood cells have been found inside of dinosaur fossils that are supposedly 200 and 300 or more million years old. And so this has been reported Institute of Creation Research and I'm sure Answers in Genesis. It's not something for some reason that the evolutionist community is really talking much about. But they're going to have to deal with the reality of it. Next slide. Now here we're looking at, this could be a picture of the Grand Canyon, because the Grand Canyon is a tremendous geological structure. Now the evolutionist explanation for the Grand Canyon is that the Colorado River slowly, over hundreds of millions of years, has carved that canyon out to the depth of over 1 mile. And of course, how many of you have ever visited the Grand Canyon? Or Palo Duro Canyon? You've seen the layers, haven't you? And so we wonder about the explanation of those layers. So the evolutionists, of course, say that these layers are explained by the passage of time. At the bottom of this, it's called the geologic column. They note that the creatures there are simple creatures like snails and shellfish and clams and worms and things like that. So, you know, the types of creatures that supposedly were the first to emerge into existence. And then as you work your way up, the creatures become more sophisticated until in the middle layers you start getting fish, and then you start getting dinosaurs, and a little higher up you start getting mammals, and don't really find human fossils in these layers. But at the top there you begin finding dinosaurs, your mastodons, and great creatures like that. So the evolutionists say, that's just the order in which these creatures evolved. And then they were buried, slowly buried, because, you know, it's 4 billion years. And then another layer of life comes in, and then they're buried, and so forth, and it works up like that. So the scientific creationists, especially Dr. Morris, had a different idea about that. And he says, no, that whole thing, a mile deep, is the ring. The type of bodies, where they were when the flood started. The creatures at the bottom of the sea, of course, were first buried, so that's where they're going to be. They're at the bottom. And then as you work your way up, some creatures begin to occur higher up. And this has to do with, if you can imagine, filling a bathtub of water and pouring a mixture of different sizes and shapes of objects into the water, they would settle at different rates. Some of them would settle quicker. Some of them would settle like maybe a feather, would settle much slower. And so in the end, if you just let it all settle out, your light stuff would be towards the top, and your dense stuff would be at the bottom. And so that is one explanation, part of it. But much of it has to do with mobility. Now there's a scientist, his name is Dr. Timothy Clary, and when they were here about 5 years ago, I know Brother Watson attended his lecture. He's an oil field geologist. And what he's doing is he's taking these core samples that are pulled out of these oil wells going down 20 and 30,000 feet. And he's examining what's in these core samples as you go from the bottom to the top. And through these experiments, he's been able to actually develop how the flood progressed. Now, for our interest, different back then, but in what is now the Gulf of Mexico, what is down there of Brownsville and down in that area, the flood began to come in. Now, if you think of the flood as something that occurred like filling a bathtub, and it's over, that's the wrong idea. The flood came as surges. And so water would come into the land and then it would surge back in. And each time it came in just a little bit farther and a little bit farther and rose higher and higher. And so over 150 days, the availability of dry land began to get less and less. Now, your creatures like your dinosaurs or horses even that could run and escape, well, they were running for high ground. That's why those tracks you find along the Biloxi River, they're running for high ground. If you get up into Wyoming up in there, there's tremendous deposits of dinosaur and fossil, they call them fossil graveyards. There's places where it's pits and it's just full. It looks like dump trucks backed into those pits and just dumped all that stuff in there. That's where all of these bones of these animals were washed into these pits as the balance of the water overcame them until, of course, everything was dead. And so this is the geologic column. There's explanations of that. No reason to buy the evolutionary idea. Next slide. So as I say, the Grand Canyon is about a mile deep. More than 15 rock layers can be seen. The bottom layer contains fossils of simple animals. Let me say something about that bottom layer. It's called the Cambrian. They use evolutionary terms, but it's called the Cambrian layer. Beneath the Cambrian layer is not basalt, maybe it's basalt, but it's rock, and there are no fossils in that layer, nothing, because that is the foundation of what the earth is resting on. That's the crust of the earth down there. No life in there. The next layer up, the so-called Cambrian layer, they call it the explosion of life because it's filled with life. All of these simple creatures that were buried. And so that's explained by the flood dynamics. The evolutionists have their explanation. So I've kind of gone through this already about the progression of animals as you work your way up, and finally the upper layers containing the larger animals. All right, next slide. So where are the transition fossils? Who typed this? Who's misspelled fossils? So as I've already said, out of billions of fossils now found, examined, and cataloged, the experts say no true and the bird. And the Archaeopteryx, they found fossils of it, and it looks kind of like a bat in some of its fossils. But when the experts say, there was lots of weird creatures long ago, because the God of glory chose to make a lot of variety of life. And so the evolutionist claims of transition fossils, such as Archaeopteryx, have been disproven. And for that reason, after 150 years of camping on fossils and trying to bring Darwin's dream to fruition, they've largely given up. They're just not talking about fossils much. You'll find, of course, them discussed in biology books because biology books are always 50 years behind the times. They're never up to date. So what do evolutionists want to talk about now? They want to talk about DNA. Next slide. I think this might be the end. All right, can we go to, Brother Brent, maybe, I don't know if you need help that next series. Across the created genetic barriers. What is evolution? That one kind of creature can become a completely different kind of creature. Genesis technology that God uses for identification. Things that you read about in one, the canine kind, equine kind, or the bovine kind. But these are broad categories, and these are the kinds that are taught in Genesis. All right, I'm moving on. Now here is this is a picture that is included in almost all biology textbooks. And it was a picture that blew my mind in 1974 when I was in Biology 101. This is a little bit different, but boy, I wish I had brought that stick. We need a draft in here to serve as, can I stand on this by any chance? So here's the picture. Oh, that won't work. You won't get the picture.
I'm trying to find something for you.
Back there somewhere. I think it's leaning against the wall or something.
Okay.
All right, I'm stable now. So here, of course, is a fish. It says that was 3. You notice it's a true fish. The gill slit right here. So its fins, it has its dorsal fins up here. These are pectoral. These are used to so the fish can raise and lower its elevation in the water. For stability. Say now.
I'm sorry. Forgive me.
So supposedly, according to this picture, 5 here. So this towards the surface, and so it would swim underneath the surface, and it would stick its head up every once in a while and gulp air. And it supposedly had some kind of an air sac, and the air was stored in the sac. And so it's gone from this to this. It's lost its gills. Now, evolution, any changes this fish in the first place to notice the tail has changed radically. Notice it's lost all of its top fins, the ones that keep this thing vertical and keep it from flopping over. It doesn't sound like this thing here would be doing too well in a watery environment. For swimming, paddling, and then they can move them like this, and so it can ascend or descend into the water. If you look carefully here, the fins are still there, but what's this? Remember the day that my professor presented this, and I was 24 years old. I should have had some maturity. But you know what? There was a test on the following Monday, and I had a lot to cram. And he showed us that picture, and the fin had turned into a stub. And he says, see, this stub is evolving into a leg. And I thought, what? Pages of notes to memorize, and I had to move on. But if I was there today, I would say, Mr. Professor, I have a question. And you say that now it looks to me like it's going to become a meat. And then they are but still the water really existed. And so finally it lost its gills here. So now it's developing an entirely new circulatory and respiratory. How long can you hold your breath? How long can you hold your breath? He doesn't even know. Not very long. We're not. And so these things aren't designed to survive. They're not the best of the best. And so supposedly then the end product was the first amphibian that crawled out onto the land. All right, next slide. I'm going to show you the idea that they have perpetuated through the years for the evolution of birds. Supposedly, later after the amphibians, one of the characteristics of reptiles is and so the dinosaurs then supposedly, it's like a tree thing, and then they show it branching off, and some dinosaurs began to evolve into birds, which means they had to begin to evolve feathers. So reptilian dinosaurs with scaly and then, of course, they had to figure out how to fly. At first, they just launched themselves from trees, and then one day one of them had the brilliant idea of actually flapping its flaps or whatever and began to fly. So we need to go back forward. Now, next slide. And so here we have a dinosaur. All right, a two-legged dinosaur. Well, it's kind of like a bird, isn't it? It's got two legs, you know, walks on the two legs. And otherwise, it doesn't look much like a bird to me. Okay, next slide. But this is supposed to be the transitional creature, something like this. Now, this is an artist's conception. We're not saying that they've ever found a fossil that looked like this. They haven't. But you notice they have added feathers to it. Not real feathers, but so-called primitive feathers. But these kinds of feathers have never been found like this. And animals to whales. Now think about this now. So there was, okay, I got that. And then the fish crawled out of the water and became land-dwelling animals, okay, amphibians, and amphibians became reptiles, all right. And then out of the reptiles, there developed birds, one branch, and eventually mammals developed. And then something very strange happened. All right, next slide. A land-dwelling animal, and for a long time this was the popular idea here, the hippopotamus, evolved back into a whale. Now, it makes sense. There's a certain amount of logic to this, and this is what hooks biology students. Because there's always a certain amount of things that would cause you to think, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. After all, the whale is blubbery, like a whale, isn't it? And the hippo does live in the water. Well, they can go in the Gulf of air. That tail, though, I don't know. That doesn't seem like it has much promise for a whale fluke. But, you know, anyway, for a long time, the idea was it was a hippo that slowly went into the water through many, many, many tiny little changes and slowly evolved into a whale. Next slide. But then some says, you know, I don't think it's the hippo. I think it's more like this creature, which really looks to me like a dog. I don't see any resemblance between this and any water-dwelling mammal or fish or anything else. But anyway, this is more the current idea as far as whale evolution. Can you imagine the numbers of transitions and steps that would have to occur between converting this thing here into a whale? Whales are astonishing beasts. They're not just huge, but their whole physiology, their respiratory system, their circulatory system. Unlike a hippo that can only go down a few feet in the water, whales can dive hundreds of feet under the water. They can cope with the tremendous pressure changes that they encounter. Every 10 feet as you descend into the ocean, you get 14.6 pounds per square inch more pressure on your body. By the time, well, think about what happened down at the wreck there of the Titanic, what was that, a year or so ago? They got down there at about 9,000 feet, and that miracle submersible, it imploded. That's the kinds of pressures that whales deal with. And that all had to be slowly evolved if evolution be true. Next slide. And so supposedly the hippo or the dog or something turned into this. And next slide. And that little old hippo tail turned into this. Or that little bedraggled dog tail turned into this. Laterally, whales go like this. Next slide. Here's one we've been waiting for, from monkeys and apes to human beings. I call it the story of imagination and fake fossils. This is what evolution is, my friends. It's a story of imagination that is very, very cleverly written. And it is so cleverly written that it has fooled 95% of the human race on earth today. Next slide. All right, here's Carlos. Sorry, Carlos. Are there any Carloses in here? I don't have anything against gorillas. They're cool creatures. Yeah, they're cool. They really are. But anyway, monkeys, gorillas, they're in the same family. And so anyway, supposedly we started from something like this. Next slide. And there was a logical progression from this, Australopithecus. That's what that lady, I can't remember her name, in Africa, she spent her whole life looking for fossils, these so-called in-between fossils. Homo habilis, Homo erectus. This is where finally this thing finally stood up straight. And wow, it had a brilliant brainstorm. It learned how to use a club. Woo. And then Homo neanderthalensis. And finally, Homo sapiens, which is supposedly the species name of human beings. For a long time in this series, there was something, biology books for more than 100 years. And it was still in biology books after it was finally discovered that, and they stained them to make them look old, and they made a few modifications, and they fooled the best scientists on earth. Now, how could that be? You know what? If you want to believe something, you will believe it. The job of a scientist is to work objectively, not allowing his or her feelings or even religious preferences to interfere in what you observe in your scientific work. And so it took more than 100 years for Piltdown Man to be removed from the textbooks and the admission made that it was a fraud all along. That's not the only fraud that has been perpetuated. There was another fraud that I encountered in Biology 101 in 1974. Now, I didn't live in the days of Darwin, you understand. I was a little after that.
I don't have a song.
John didn't get it.
I don't have a song for that one.
But anyway, it was a fraud that was designed by a man named Ernst Haeckel. He was a German, and I don't mean to say bad things about the German people, but a lot of very atheistic things have come from Germany, because it was a center of so-called rational theology and philosophy. But Ernst Haeckel was an embryologist. Embryology is the study of the development of the unborn from conception right up. Had some artistic skills, apparently. And so he drew a chart that supposedly showed various stages of pregnancy. And then one line was the embryological development of human beings. And so stages of pregnancy. And now, of course, this was long before there was such a thing as sonograms and things of that nature. But anyway, he developed this chart, and he deceived the scientific community hook, line, and sinker. Preachers. Progeny was the time it was on tests. It was a mantra. You know what a mantra is? That's what Buddhists do. And we were We said it over and over again. It was repeated over and over again in almost every lecture on biological evolution, ontogeny, pregnancy. I was merely reliving. And then it was discovered are the researchers, and then there are the teachers and the textbooks. And here's the deal. Textbooks are expensive. Research scientists discovered this fraud, and for more than 100 years, as I said, in 1974, I was still learning ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And I didn't have a clue. Not a clue that it was a fraud until I ran across it some years later.